Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining the webinar from. My name is Niresh Swami, and I'm a product expert for the PAM suite of products here at Manage Engine. As you can see on the screen here today, what we are going to discuss is how to craft and secure the life cycle of an employee's privileged access journey in your organization. Now, before I dive into the specifics and the nitty-gritties of what we're going to talk about, I'd like to talk about my experience as a remote vendor in the past. Right. So before my time at Manage Engine, I used to work as a third-party auditor who was outsourced from another organization, which was a multinational European bank. Right. And my daily tasks included going through logs, change management logs, incident logs, and noting down my findings in reports. Right. So from the story, you can assume that my access journey in that particular organization required no sort of privileged access whatsoever. However, I would like you to note three things. I was given VPN-based access to enter the corporate's network. That means I had complete control of the password that was allocated to me in order to log into their system. Second, during my time within their network, my actions went completely unmonitored and had no sort of administrative supervision over what I could do during these remote sessions. And the third for you to note is that even after the completion of my tenure with this particular project, my passwords still remained active, right? Do not ask why I know that. Human curiosity cannot be contained, right? Now, these three phases of an employee's access journey is exactly what we will be talking about today, right? We will look at different use cases where an employee is being onboarded into a system and how you can allocate least privileged access to this particular person and how you can securely offboard them from your organization. Now, I assume that all organizations of all attendees present here would use a minimal password vault to vault their enterprise passwords, right? If you've done that, great. You've taken your first step towards privileged access management. But privileged access goes way beyond that in the modern era, right? It all depends on what this particular user does with the password that is shared to this person, right? You also need to monitor the remote sessions that are being started using these passwords. Their behavior with these remote sessions is to be noted and to be analyzed. If this particular person needs elevated access into the system, that should also be governed by your access management tool. Your access management strategies does not end with password vaulting, especially in the modern era, because of multitude of privileged identities that have plagued your enterprise, right? You might have a separate CI/CD platform that's working where secrets are being used to perform privileged operations on the daily in a very regular basis, right? All of these secrets are most often hard-coded. That is also something that PAM takes care of. Your certificates and other machine identities for which you'll need to govern the entire life cycle, uh, especially now that Google has come up with its 90-day certificate plans, and Apple has followed suit with its 40-day strategies, right? So your certificates and other machine identities should also be governed by your PAM tool. And these are all things that we will be seeing today, right? Three phases that we spoke about will now inculcate these privileged access management strategies that we spoke about and in turn craft the ideal employee's access journey with the help of privileged access management in your enterprise or your organization. So the first use case that we will be seeing today is a case of access fatigue. So John is a remote third-party vendor such as I was in my previous tenure. Right? John requires privileged access as part of his task requirements. But the problem is that when John was onboarded and passwords were shared to John, it was done in a very haphazard manner that John does not practice password hygiene even if he wants to, because John stores and shares passwords in text format because there's so many passwords that John handles in a daily basis. And it is humanly impossible to manage these passwords by himself on his own without slipping up due to his human errors here and there, right? And a security ramification for such simple slip-ups by John could lead to critical endpoints in an enterprise being compromised due to credential exposure and whatnot. And these could very well lead to business consequences, as we very well know, because we've been seeing such news pop up about organizations ever so often, right? So let's figure out what went wrong. Let's storify this particular problem and see where these slip-ups could have happened, both from John's side and the organization side, right? First, like I said, John was given VPN-based access to enter the network. That means more than necessary access privileges were allocated to John when John did not require them in the first place, right? So John has access to multiple endpoints which he can access through a single password. That means it creates a single point of entry, leading to one failure, one centralized point of failure, which could lead to devastating effects if credentials are exposed, right? John also has permanent standing access to these resources at any point in time, right? And John also does not practice password hygiene because of the load of passwords that he handles on a daily basis, right? The solution to this complex problem, as it may seem, is very much simple, right? You simply need a secure vendor onboarding routine. It just need not be haphazard, right? All these passwords can be shared to John via a simple PAM tool, right? And post which, when John is onboarded into the PAM tool, John can be allocated a role and be given least privileged access in a just-in-time manner when John needs it. We will look at all of this, how it works on a PAM tool right now. But just to not overwhelm you, just stick on to what we're looking at here, right? All of the secrets and the passwords that are shared to John are also to be rotated in a regular manner. And these access that are shared to John is to be revoked once John's tasks are completed during his tenure, right? And now we will see how all of this works in a privileged access management tool, right? For the case of this use case, the tool that we will be using is Manage Engine's PAM 360. It's the enterprise grade PAM platform of Manage Engine, right? We will jump into the specifics of what PAM 360 is towards the end of the session. But for now, let me give you a wide overview of what you're seeing on the screen right now, right? So anyone who logs into PAM 360 as an administrator, as you can see, I've logged in here as an administrator, right? The administrator has access to a password dashboard where they get an entire overview of all the passwords that are stored in the enterprise in the PAM tool, right? So as any PAM tool goes, PAM 360 also has two primary components that it is based on. One, the privileged users such as John who use PAM 360 to gain access to the critical resources or endpoints stored in the PAM tool. And a second component being the endpoints that John and other privileged users in your organization will be accessing, right? So user onboarding is pretty simple, right? You can either add a user manually, or you can import users from files if you have a short number of users, right? Or you can also import them from your Active Directory or other directory services that you may have deployed in your organization, right? Now, once that is done, these users can be associated roles based on the task that they will be performing. By default in PAM 360, there are administrative and non-administrative roles, But if you'd like to customize the roles that you would like to give to these privileged users, you can also go ahead and customize roles based on existing templates that PAM 360 offers, right? So you can go ahead and choose if John will be allowed to upload files or download files, if John can generate reports of password activity, or if John can add or import passwords from the tool and whatnot, right? The role creation is completely customizable in PAM 360, and any type of role can be created according to your convenience and the tasks that are necessary for the privileged user and can be associated with those particular users, right? Now, once these users are onboarded, these users can also be grouped into specific groups, right? So suppose you have a maintenance task that's been outsourced, or if you have certain installation tasks that have been outsourced, you can create different user groups for these particular outsourced vendors and add them to that particular user group, right? I'll tell you why this is important in just a bit, right? Before that, let's see how you can onboard your endpoints in your organization into the PAM tool, right? Similarly, you can add resources manually or from file if you have a limited number of resources, which is not usually the case. So that is why you go ahead and discover different types of resources from your organization. You can discover Windows resources based on the domain control information that you have, Linux resources based on IP address, network devices, your virtual machines, or endpoints from your AWS instances. All of these can be onboarded onto PAM 360. Once that is done, right, these can also be grouped into resource groups, as we call it in PAM 360, right? Once these resources are grouped based on the need of access, these resource groups or resources can also be shared with users or with user groups. So it becomes very simple when you onboard a user and put them into a group. And if this particular resource group has already been shared to John, right? And if you're given full access to this particular resource group, the work for the administrator has already been cut out. All that the administrator needs to do is to onboard John into the PAM tool, and John will be allotted access to these machines whenever he needs them based on request release workflows that you can configure within the PAM tool, right? Which we will see along with the second use case. But before that, let's see how this can also be automated with the help of your workflow orchestration tools, such as your service desk tools that sit at the crux of your enterprise workflow orchestrations in your organization, right? For Service Desk Plus, which is Manage Engine's own ITSM software, can be integrated with PAM 360 with the help of SCIM connector. So what basically happens is that when a request or a ticket is being created in Service Desk Plus to onboard a particular user, the service request immediately sends a call to the HRMS solution, and their particular ID will be created by the HRMS tool. Once that is done, it will also follow suit in your directory spaces, where such as your Active Directory or Entra environments, where an temporary IAM account based on the length of the tenure is also created, right? A department is associated for them, a role and the access privileges is defined in the IAM account itself. Now, with the help of SCIM connectors, this information is transported to PAM 360, where a similar temporary PAM account is created for the vendor, right? And they are also added to these particular user groups that we just saw, right? And hence will also have passwordless access to the critical endpoints in the enterprise on a need-only basis. Not just that, these sessions that John or other privileged users are onboarded automatically launch can also be monitored and recorded and audited for investigative purposes later. This is something that we'll see in the next use case right away, right? So let's take a look at the second use case, where the human error in this case is simple careless oversight, right? Sneha, like any other remote vendor, needs administrative access to critical endpoints to perform installations. But the problem is, Sneha has administrative access to these systems full time. But one thing to note is that Sneha in this particular place does not need access to the PAM tool itself. Sneha only needs access to the particular machine in the PAM tool, right? So why create more visibility for Sneha when all her tasks that is associated to her job role is contained within the use of a particular endpoint and not the PAM tool itself, right? In case administrative access is given full time to Sneha, to critical server side endpoints where installations is to be done, it can cause major disruptions in service if credentials get exposed, as we already know, right? It also gives these threat actors lateral entry into the network, right? So let's see what can go wrong here, right? Standing admin privileges to necessary endpoints can lead to credential exposure and hence business consequences, as we've already seen. Lateral entry into the network, because this gives them admin level access and hence elevated access across the network, right? No access controls are in place to enable least privileged access, because Sneha does not need access to the PAM tool. Sneha only needs access to the machine that is stored in the PAM tool, right? And these sessions that are launched by Sneha to perform her installation tasks go unmonitored, right? And hence, if suspicious activity is noted, these sessions cannot be terminated by an administrator, right? Now, the solution to these problems, again, is very simple, right? You simply need a password request release workflow every time Sneha needs access to this particular machine, right? And hence providing just-in-time privilege elevation when they need admin level access to the endpoint, right? Again, these are all jargons that may sound like it as of now, but as we jump into the demo, all these can be cleared out very soon, right? Not just that, with the help of a PAM tool, administrators can also create access policies based on real-time risk assessments for these endpoints that are stored in the PAM tool and for the users, right? Risk scores can be associated, and based on a threshold of risk scores, access policies can be created which dictate whether Sneha and other privileged users who need admin level access to these systems are given access or not, right? As we already discussed, remote sessions can be monitored and terminated upon suspicious activity, right? And these sessions can also be audited and recorded for investigative purposes later. Now, we will see how this happens in through a small demo with an integration with Service Desk Plus, as we've already spoken about, right? So in the previous use case, we saw that John was to be onboarded through a service ticket that is to be created. As you can see, this is a particular service ticket where John is onboarded and the employee details of first name, last name, and email ID is associated with John's account, right? Now let's assume this has also been done for Sneha, right? And now as an administrator, I'm going to let Sneha take a remote session to an endpoint that is stored in the PAM tool for her to perform her tasks. As you can see, the asset or the machine that Sneha will access is being associated to the particular service request, right? And the technician in this case is Sneha. So we'll associate the ticket to Sneha. And once that is done, once that is done, we're also defining the job or the task that Sneha will be performing as part of the ticket, and we're adding the request, right? And you can see that this is being done by an administrator in the ticketing tool. Now we'll quickly switch to Sneha screen. You can see that we've now logged in as Sneha, right? And in the activities tab, you can see that a particular service is associated to Sneha's account, right? And now as soon as Sneha picks up this particular ticket to work on it, right? Sneha is going to go and take a privilege session into the endpoint. But the problem herein lies that Sneha has not yet requested access to the particular machine, right? As you can see, no accounts associated with the user is being flagged. Now we'll see how this happens in the PAM tool, right? I've now logged in as an administrator in the PAM tool. And in the audits tab, you can see that read and modify access to the particular endpoint has been revoked in this case, right? So when Sneha hits get access for the resource, a custom function gets executed, right, in the backend, which allows Sneha, through the help of the integration, to allot just-in-time access to Sneha to perform her task, right? Once that is done, you will see that Sneha will be able to launch a remote session into the particular endpoint, right? In the PAM tool, you'll also see that once we refresh the audits tab, you can see that read and modify access has now been allotted for Sneha, right? So every single privileged operation is being audited and recorded, right? So now Sneha is initiating a session to the endpoint, an RDP session into the endpoint, right? And Sneha will now go ahead and perform the task, which is to install a browser plugin in this case, right? Now, what essentially happens after the browser plugin has been installed by Sneha? Sneha will now close the session and hence close the ticket because the job has now been completed. And you will see that as soon as Sneha closes the particular ticket after her job is done, as you can see on the screen now, Sneha will no longer have privileged access to that particular machine. And in the audit tab, you'll see the read and modify access has now been revoked. So even if credentials are exposed, or if Sneha feels curious, right, a privileged session cannot be launched. And this action will also be audited in the PAM tool. Right? Now, as you can see that this is being done for Sneha because Sneha does not need access to the PAM tool. Sneha can directly launch remote session from the service management tool itself, which in this case serves Test Plus, right? Now, if in case there are privileged users who need just-in-time elevations to be done to certain resources that are stored in the PAM tool, that can also be done, right? So in this case, I have logged in as an administrator, right? And this is a particular resource that we are going to configure an access control to. So with this particular user account, we are going to ensure that users are forced to provide a reason for password retrieval, right? And this access is also to be approved by one administrator, and immediately after the access is done, the password will also be revoked. Now, one thing to note is that we are elevating this particular user account to the local group of remote desktop users, right? You can fetch other groups and add them if you need to, based on the groups that are there as part of that particular local group. Now, in the users tab, you can see how different it is to the admin tab. On the left side of the screen, you see that almost all the privileges that an administrator might have, the user or the normal privileged user does not have it, right? And the user logged in here will only be able to see the resources that are shared to them. Now they're going to open a connection to this particular resource. But in order to do that, we've enforced that this user is to provide a reason, right? So the user is now created an access request, and in the administrator tab, you will see that this access request will have to be approved by an administrator. So the administrator goes ahead and processes the request based on the reason, right? And once that is approved, in the users tab, the user will now be able to use the password to launch a remote session temporarily, right? So you can see that in the groups, in remote desktop users, which is the group that we wanted the user to be part of, the user has now been added, right? Now, once the user has performed their task, they're going to check in the password, right? Immediately, if you go into the admin tab and we launch a remote session as an administrator to the same endpoint, right? And see if that particular user has been removed from the remote desktop users group. As you can see, they've now been removed because that task is now completed and they've closed the session, right? So that is essentially how you perform just-in-time elevation. And all of these actions are also audited, right? The privilege has been elevated, the password has been retrieved, the session was started, and then the session ended. All of the privileged operations performed by the user is audited in PAM 360, right? Now that brings us to the end of the second use case. Now, the third use case is a case of mismanaged offboarding, right? John has access to critical domain systems within the enterprise, right? So John's tenure is now ended and John is to be offboarded out of the organization, right? But standing access for John in the organization leads to critical loopholes to the password routine that is as part of your organization, right? An ex-employee with standing privileges is a critical uh, business oversight and cannot be allowed, right? If John has copied the passwords or if standing access is there, and if threat actors gain exposure to these standing access, right, it can lead to critical business consequences if that happens. Now, let's see what can go wrong in this case, right? An ex-employee with standing privileges is critical, as we've already established, right? If copied passwords remain active post-exit, that is also a problem, right? That means that when uh, John does not need access to these endpoints, the passwords, if they still remain active, if John even or if threat actors with malicious purposes get access to these passwords, they can launch remote sessions into your enterprise with zero admin oversight, right? And the problem here also lies that these privileged users often have complex access portfolios that can lead to blind sight in shared privileges. So the solution again is pretty simple, right? You need to create an employee offboarding workflow where all of these, the copied passwords are rotated, the privileges associated to John and other permissions associated to John are transferred to a different ownership, right? Log management for all employee exits are also managed for investigative purposes, right? As we've already seen. Now, this is also done with the help of an integration between Service Desk Plus and PAM 360, right? A service request, as it was done for an onboarding, it's also done for offboarding, right? Once a ticket is created, the offboarding is initiated from the HRMS tool, and hence also transports the same workflow into your directory services such as Entra or AD, right? The IAM account that was created temporarily is also disabled. Once that is done, the vendor account in PAM 360 is locked. All the passwords that were shared to this vendor are reset, and all the privileges are transferred to a different person of authority or the manager or a different person, right, based on the protocols. And the vendor's account is also deleted from the system. Now, we will see all of this happen in the tool itself, right? As you can see, we're back in PAM 360. The users, in the users tab, you see that John is the user that we will be offboarding, right? You can see in the access snapshot, the entire access portfolio that John has access to are 3 critical Windows resources, right? Now, these resources are to be transferred to a different person. So we will go and create a request for an employee offboarding in the ticketing tool. So the account name, which in this case is John, will also be input. The requester name, which is the person making the request right now here, the account's name. And you see the deprovisioning a user to revoke privileged server access is the reason. Immediately, the integration is triggered, and all of the action that we saw was necessary will be performed automatically, right? The user account, as you can see in the logs, you can see that the user account has been locked successfully. Passwords of all the resources owned and accessed by John has been reset, and the permissions are transferred to a person of different authority, right? And the user account has been deleted from PAM360. You will see all of this happen live in PAM360 also, right? So let's switch to PAM360. And once we hit refresh, John's account will no longer be part of the user profile in PAM360, right? In the audit tab, you can see that John's account is locked, password reset has been triggered, ownership has been changed, and the user has been deleted. Now that brings us to the end of the third use case, right? Let's take a quick recap about what we've seen, right? And what you've achieved by doing these by performing these strategies of privileged access management, and hence creating an ideal employee access workflow, right? In terms of onboarding, we've now practiced complete governance over all onboarded privileged users, right? Right from the place of password sharing, right from the creation of a role for that particular user, you practice complete governance over the life cycle of onboarding of these privileged users, right? You also take an alternative approach to VPN-based remote access, right? And hence you prevent credential exposure and hence network infiltration, right? You also limit the visibility to simply the necessary endpoints that this particular person needs access to without giving permanent access into the network via VPN or via other methods, right? In terms of least privileged access, you mandate a temporary request release workflows for these privileged users who need privileged access to the system, right? You also create access policies at a granular level to elevate to administrative access if and when required, right? You also audit all privileged activity in the network. And in terms of offboarding, you now have a streamlined employee offboarding process in place of an haphazard process that might have been possible, right? You eliminate post-contract credential exposure. That means the credentials that might have been remaining active after an employee's exit no longer exist because they've all been reset, right? And hence all standing privileges are deemed null and void. You eliminate insider threats from ex-employees also. Now, to do all of this, you need a PAM tool, is what we've established. But apart from the technical benefits, privileged access management as a concept itself gives you multiple other business benefits, right? It helps you stay compliant with regional compliance standards such as PCI DSS, GDPR, SEBI, HIPAA, etc., right? And several cyber insurance providers deem privileged access management strategies to be necessary as part of an organization to reduce the annual premiums that you'll be paying for cyber insurance, right? And as we've established, SSL/TLS certificates that are part of your enterprise, your developer secrets, and other machine identities, which are to be managed in a timely basis, can also be done using PAM360, right? And not just that, when you have a PAM strategy in place, your IT maturity progress itself is catalyzed, putting you ever so close to achieving zero standing privileges than ever before, right? And to do all of that, you don't need multiple different tools in place. You just need one master tool that is capable of doing all of this, which in this case is something that ManageEngine offers, which is ManageEngine PAM360, the full stack enterprise PAM platform, which is capable of doing everything that we've seen today, doing everything that we have talked about today, and much more. All right, I think that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for your patience.